Hey, we're live. I'm streaming with my mentor Larry and the gorgeous effeminate degenerate. So how are you guys holding up with the quarantine?
Terrible. I've had to take psychological medication to manage anxiety symptoms because of the broad panic and disorder in the world, which
Oh,
is kind of horrible. But it worked, and I picked one that's not habit forming or narcotic, so I can step down off of it once some level of normalcy returns. So that's something.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
It is what it is.
yeah. I think the quarantine has had a less of an impact on my life than it had on many people because I was already kind of a depressed shut-in before the quarantine started. So the only thing that really changed is now I'm a depressed shut-in with a justification for being a depressed shut-in.
Yeah. My personal problem was less being locked down and more about how everybody's panicking, and now it's turning out, oh hey, turns out the virus was out in the world for at least 2 to 3 more weeks, which means all the assumptions we've been locking everybody down in, shutting down businesses, destroying people's livelihoods, are based on, guesswork that was really faulty. And no one will be held accountable for it. And the people who did it will be, lionized as great heroes. How wonderful is that?
That sounds really wonderful. Sounds like the real world,
Yeah. Unfortunately.
So do you think that that we should end the lockdown then?
It's more complicated than that. There's things we should have done that we didn't do. And since we didn't do those things, it's going to be harder to try to do those correct policies now on the back end. I think the best option you have is to step down from what we have and then try to step in correct policies, because somewhere in the neighborhood of like 70% of people who died from COVID-19 have respiratory and cardiac comorbidities, especially things like COPD and heart disease, also diabetes. So what you could have done in the United States and most developed countries, the state system has a list of who these people are. You could say, hey, we believe you have a high risk in the current virus outcome. Maybe you need to stay inside for your safety. And then it would be a much smaller footprint to give them a temporary social safety net so that they would be okay. But instead, we decided to panic and go through a traumatic experience as a world, which, if we're lucky, will help unite us and bring us towards some better understanding of things. But if we look at all the trauma that are in movies and television these days, we're not going to learn anything. And nobody's going to have any answers, but everybody's going to feel justified and proud. It's great.
So we're gonna travel around the world, figure ourselves out, absolutely learning nothing.
Yeah, that seems to be the direction this is going in. So, go ahead. Sorry.
I guess one thing that we could learn to do is when these sorts of pandemics start, a more direct close down in affected areas needs to happen immediately, and there needs to be openness and honesty about the true danger of this pandemic, because I do see a lot of people downplaying the dangers of COVID-19. And of course, COVID-19 is not the Black Death, but if, say, China had immediately, instituted a shutdown of its borders and not allowed anyone who had been visiting the country to leave, it could have slowed the pandemic greatly. Also, openness about the honesty of, the true danger of the disease.
If society and culture can learn one virtue in the 21st century, it's transparency. Transparency is the central virtue that we need as a society right now, but we don't want to do that. We want all the people in positions of power and decision-making to be isolated from transparency and positive discourse, so we end up getting what we're getting. So we're going to have to put in a little filler here because our host had to go take care of something in the background, but we can banter for a little bit.
Oh, sure. I wouldn't mind getting to know you a bit more, Larry.
I mean, sure, why not?
Unlike
a lot of people who he hangs around with, I'm actually using my name. I use my name on social media.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just a normal person who didn't get his life right together in high school, but of course came from a good family with a good intellectual discourse and tradition. So I was intelligent, but I didn't have anything to do or use with my intelligence until I put my nose to the grindstone, went through community college, and then college, got a degree. Then the legs fell out for the world in 2008, and then I just lost 2 productive years. And I've been slowly trying to get back on top. And I'm also working on a crowdfunding comic book project. I've finally got my money together because the end of last year wasn't good for me financially.
Oh, I see.
And I was able to pay for my first 2 pages. Now I have to figure out which 2 pages I want to start the art with. Though I just realized earlier when I was talking to somebody else about it, I said, you should really just go to the artist and say, hey, which 8 pages here do you think are the best ones to do? And also, if you want to call an audible on how some of these are structured, you've got 25 plus years in the industry. You tell me what would be the best art thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is always best to go with the advice you can get from the experts and relevant professionals in the field.
Well, what's fascinating is with comic books and to a lesser extent TV and movies, they're very collaborative efforts. So you're not going to have a good time if you're not going to collaborate.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Oh, keep talking. I'm just thinking.
No. Okay. So, when I pitched the idea to Bolt, he talked about various talking about pop culture and literature, but something I like to talk to people about because they don't know is the trauma theory of literature. Now, when it was first started playing out in comics, media, and pop culture in the 80s and 90s, you'd see a lot of anti-hero archetypes. You'd see a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, very tentative, not very well structured post-traumatic stress disorder. Some kind of cliche things about dissociative identity disorder featured in things. That was the earliest phases of trauma theories that's entered into the mainstream of our culture. Sometime between 2010 and 2015, however, it's become a much more dominant cultural force in pop culture on a broad level because it's connected politically with intersectionality, because at its core, the trauma theory of literature, as it applies to both literature and as a perspective on viewing the broader world, reflects on how trauma shapes identity and how traumatic experiences create identities that are both authentic and real, but also can't really be expressed to people who don't live a part of that trauma. So the idea in expressing that deeper aspect of trauma theory is to try to express that truth to people who the theory says can't experience it and thus can't understand it. And that's why there's all sorts of weird decisions that are being made in movies and TV.
Okay, so you think that our culture is being shaped by people who are trying to explain trauma to those who haven't experienced it because they believe that trauma can only be understood by those who have experienced it.
So a lot of people who write movies and TV went to college, got a 4-year degree, or at least 1 or 2 years of degrees. This is very influential theory in English literature departments, in filmmaking departments. So I think it's bubbled up from there. I also think a lot of people who are older and more seasoned in the industry have a lot of interns who they've been drawing a lot of youthful energy from, who are influenced by it. I don't think it's like, people are consciously saying, yes, let's hammer this in here. Also, there's, the whole commodification of identity trend in the broader pop culture. So for industry leaders that are very big into that sort of thing, they view this as a gateway to sell people's traumatic racial, gender, and other identities back to them and make a profit.
Okay. So basically, you see this as people profiting off of the traumatic experiences of the past few decades.
Well, no. It's not just the past few decades. It's because you can look at trauma as a literary theory thing going back to the 19th century, because the ideas for trauma theory originally come from a Freudian analysis of trauma.
Okay.
And it's been started originally in psychology, then it started to go into other interdisciplinary social sciences from there. But in the last decade, it's been more prominent because it's been more influential in creative communities and creative intelligentsia, and people want to be relevant. They want to be part of the now and the moment.
And what would you say that your issues with trauma theory are?
Uh-oh. Somebody's got a fire alarm. So at a fundamental level, trauma theory also is very contrary to the Campbellian heroic narrative, which has its problems. We'll put those problems on the shelf for a moment. But the narrative is all about learning something through a cathartic experience. So what the trauma theory of literature does is it gives you a cathartic experience of trauma, but there's not something you've learned from the process. You've not come out of the other world with knowledge that you bring back into the real world. So that's the central problem with it. A lot of trauma theory insists upon itself.
Well, some could say that trauma doesn't always build people up. In fact, that it's important to know and recognize that sometimes trauma just tears you down. Sometimes traumatic experiences don't help people.
Absolutely. But that's not the purpose of media and entertainment. At a fundamental level, the expression of negative emotional experiences in media is all about the cathartic experience that Aristotle talked about. And pretty much nobody's gotten a better take on the value of catharsis, which is you're experiencing something through a simulated safe environment so you can incorporate it back into yourself. So if you're just experiencing raw, unending trauma and you don't gain anything from that experience, it's not good for you. So right now we're all having a big traumatic experience at various levels. Some people are having a very tangible traumatic experience because they have a horrible disease. They're on a ventilator in a hospital. Some people are having a traumatic experience of the fact that they're confined to their homes for the first time, and all the things they use to mitigate the various social stresses in their lives have all been taken away from them, and they're feeling utterly powerless for the first time in their lives. Wouldn't it be good if we've spent this last 10 years of popular culture teaching people, like, trauma's bad? Sometimes we don't have an answer to solve trauma, but here are ways that you can come through trauma and be stronger and be there to help other people. Be the hand up to people when they're struggling. But of course, you don't want to be a hand up for somebody who's drowning because they'll pull you in, yada, yada, yada. But that's what the role of media and storytellers has been for thousands of years. And it's a lack of quality and care that we see in popular culture now that's leading us away from that and just having trauma for trauma's sake, which is, in some respects, narcissistic.
Well, one could say that, yes, the audience matters in the creation of art, but so does the feelings of the creator. Perhaps through the creation of certain pieces, you are creating not for necessarily an audience, but for yourself. You are creating because you need to process this trauma, and through creating the work, that is your process.
Right. But we're not talking about things you can post on Tumblr or on a fan fiction website. We're talking about, in some cases, movies and TV projects that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Those are things that exist explicitly to make money, make a return on investment. And while it's important for those things to talk about issues that matter to people, and I think while we can get into the weeds on it, I think it is important for people to have broader social understanding and discourse through their experiences in media. I think historically we've seen it's been beneficial to society for that to happen. At the end of the day, that whole process, that whole experience needs to get people paid.
Yeah.
Especially the artist.
And one could say, if trauma theory is selling so well, what is the problem there? Under a capitalist logic, if it makes money, what's wrong?
Well? Is it selling well? That's the problem. So you look at The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi was very much a movie engrossed in trauma. You look at The Rise of Skywalker. It's a movie very much engrossed within trauma. Though it's not a very...
Wait, are you implying there's actually a story with The Last Skywalker?
The Rise of Skywalker, there was a story. It's just not a good one.
You sure? I'm pretty sure there was a lack of a story.
Well, there was a story. It was bad. It was bad.
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily see the Rise of Skywalker as a product of trauma. I see it as a product of wish fulfillment.
Well, there's Rey's trauma, being an orphan, believing she has no place in the world, and finding her place in the world through the traumatic struggle with Palpatine. There's been Skywalker's trauma of his parents' divorce, of his sense of his uncle's betrayal, of becoming the leader of the dark side, but then having that taken away from him. His conflict with Rey ultimately being the resolution of his trauma, and his sacrifice being his way to make it through his trauma. We could talk about Poe's whole traumatic lifestyle experience through the whole arc of the 3 movies. Now, this is not as explicitly embedded in trauma theory as something like the Harlequin movie, which is an entirely different presentation of trauma theory through a movie. But that's something that's more explicitly a part of that. The influences in something like The Rise of Skywalker it's a lot lighter because they've packed a whole lot of garbage into that movie, and it's hard for any one element to really rise out and really get focused and really get ahead of steam.
Can you cite any good example of the application of trauma theory?
Absolutely, yes. There's a TV series called Doom Patrol on DC Universe Online. Now, it was built from a perspective of superheroes as traumatic figures, going through personal trauma as connected to their powers. It's something where the people go through the whole process and realize, hey, I'm screwed up, but I was screwed up before, and I'll be screwed up later, but I know how to live with it now and how to not be a bad person because I'm screwed up. So it is possible to do it well, but to do it well, you have to have a well-crafted story, you have to have characters that are developed with care, and the characters have to have meaning and purpose. So trauma theory is used by a lot of people with lesser talents who are writing and creating who want to look like they're deep and meaningful, but they don't want to put in the work.
So how you feel about Batman? Like, do you think Nolan did a good job handling Bruce Wayne? How he
Batman wasn't so much a traumatic movie until The Dark Knight Rises, which is useful for all of its memes. But The Dark Knight Rises was about trauma. You know, everybody imprisoned in that dark hole. Batman becoming crippled. In fact, that's why whenever you see a white male protagonist in a movie who starts being crippled, being tortured, that's him becoming traumatic. And so within the framework of trauma theory, he then becomes acceptable to be a hero. Because some scholars of trauma theory argue that whiteness is a trauma to other people. So for your white protagonist to be a hero within a traumatic narrative story, he has to go through a trauma. So that's why you'll see them lose an arm, lose an eye. In the case of Thor in Avengers Endgame, he becomes fat because that gets into the whole connection with intersectionality and body positivity.
But isn't Avengers Endgame was more about dealing with, like
the trauma of half the people in the universe dying?
Yeah, like
and
all of them
coping with that reality?
Yeah, isn't that like the least good make it interesting that all these people are fundamentally are people with emotions and have different ways of coping it, like the Hulk, who basically emerged with himself.
And furthermore, like losing an aspect of yourself in the course of a journey and then emerging stronger than ever is something that has always been present in literature. You see it with Beowulf when he was, he grew old, but he still found the courage to fight the dragon. You see it with Luke Skywalker. His arm was chopped off by his father. He still found the courage to meet Palpatine and find the good within his father.
Mm-hmm.
Losing aspects of yourself and physical duress have always been part of storytelling.
Right. But the thing is not so much about that being always part of storytelling. They're arguing that's consistently how human stories have dealt with trauma, and how trauma is a uniquely transformative element of a story that is something that can't be written. It can only be experienced in a visceral way. But let me use Mad Max Fury Road as an example. Max isn't allowed to be the hero until he goes through a violent, traumatic experience in that story. And that violent, traumatic experience is having everything taken away from him, being tortured, being turned into a living blood bank for people who are considered more vital by society. And it's basically taking the folks in the dominant hegemonic cultural class and turning them into the other so that they can become heroic. Now, it was done differently in older times because there were different story sensibilities you'd have to deal with. But to the people who are deeply invested in the theoretical side of literary critical analysis, they would argue that Beowulf is absolutely a trauma literary story. Oedipus, of course, is one, but the difference is with Oedipus is the trauma comes at the end of his story. When he tears out his eyes, it's because he's learned and he removes his eyes.
Well, you could also say that Oedipus was orphaned at an early age, and that, Oedipus had, already killed his father. He just didn't know it at the beginning of the story, even though it had been prophesized. The tragedy is that he is succumbing to something that has been known to the audience all along.
But again, that's all about catharsis, is because when you get into a whole tale of hubris, you never really realize you're in the middle of a tale of hubris until it all comes snowballing at you at the end. So the only way you can gain from that story as an observer is to watch it unfold, knowing what's going to happen. But that when you look at trauma theory, we were talking about Steven Universe before we started the show. That was the major theme of what was going on with Steven Universe and Steven Universe Future. It was Steven going through the process of dealing with all the post-trauma from the entire run-up of the series. And at the end of the day, the resolution was Steven left his friends and family to go learn something new about himself somewhere else.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful lesson to learn. Just leave. Don't confront yourself. Just leave and travel the world.
He turned into a pink dragon monster with a particularly phallic-looking head that was being held by all the strong, powerful women in his life, which I think was one of the many unintended artistic guffaws that the Croniverse puts into their work.
Yeah, although maybe it was intentional. Maybe they were trying to make a commentary on masculinity. Who knows?
Well, I mean, they did do some erotic fan fiction back in the day before they all got their big break. So yeah, they could have been trying to slip something in. That's a little bit of a urban legend, possible conspiracy theory, is that some of the things in the new generation of cartoons that have gotten in that are considered subversive are things that got in at the last minute because no one was managing the store and the everything was finished. So it's like, well, I guess that happened. That's actually, several people have argued that's how Kurosami got on the screen, is that it just got inserted at the end of the show. It was already going to air and broadcast, and they were like, eh.
I don't know.
I didn't mind that. Yeah.
Well, that's why I called it a urban legend conspiracy theory, because there are people on the internet who have sources, and some of them are legitimate having sources, and some of them aren't, and you can't always evaluate that fairly.
Yeah.
Thus, you have to give a health warning. Take this with a grain of salt. But there are lots of other little weird little discontinuity in modern cartoons. It's really bad about it, which at least implies that it could be possible. But let's talk about something not traumatic that's wonderful. Let's talk about the greatest thing that's on the internet right now, Animal Crossing X Doom.
I never played that game.
Fandom. Okay, so you know what Animal Crossing is, right?
No, I don't.
It's that little game where you colonize the island and fill it with all of your little animal friends.
Hey, I'm a boomer at heart, so I don't really play. I don't keep up with things. So,
well, okay, you know what Doom is, right?
No.
And Doom it's the original shooter.
Yeah, it's the original shooter game. It's about a guy who goes to hell and shoots demons and murders them all the time, everywhere he goes. So
sounds like a great game.
So it started in February, where the lead developers and the development team of Doom were both going to launch at the same time as Animal Crossing before the world shut down from the pandemic. And both of the development teams started being positive towards each other. And the Doom character's Twitter was very positive towards one of the main character Twitters for Animal Crossing. And thus an entire boom in fandom happened where Doom people were posting positive messages on Animal Crossing boards and vice versa. And there's now like a whole fandom of people who've take a cute, adorable animal dog girl and put her in a world where she's murdering horrible demons. And they put an armored demon warrior who's fighting demons, just fishing and catching butterflies.
That's
very wholesome.
That is a very wholesome thing that the internet has done.
Man.
And you see this, capacity for great kindness and originality juxtaposed with capacity for great perversion and evil in the internet every single day.
Right. But the reason I was bringing that up is that this is a much more organic creation of combining things. And a lot of these ideas of trying to put meaning into something that are engineered, very corporate, very commercialized, they're not going to be as fun or as wholesome as watching a guy in a power armor catch fish with a small furry animal.
That sounds idyllic.
So I guess the antidote for the overly traumatic or influenced by trauma theory media that you see in today's popular culture, in your mind, would be more content that is influenced by regular people on the internet, by ordinary creators.
More organic creations. Like there's an entire YouTube cottage industry of which I'm a small part of people who commentate on pop culture and do pop culture commentary, and most of these people think of better stories than the people whose job it is to create the stories. Like Star Trek Picard, for example. Star Trek Picard ends with Data being basically given euthanasia, and Picard's life being extended by artificial means, which at a fundamental level is a violation of the original core concept of the humanism of Star Trek.
Yeah, I don't know if that seems. I never really thought Data as, I didn't see him as, just a robot. He was his own
at
human
that
being.
point, at that point in the show, he wasn't even a robot anymore. He existed as a simulation on a computer.
Okay.
And he asked Captain Picard, who wasn't even Captain Picard, he was a simulation of Captain Picard on the computer, to kill him so he could stop existing. Even though the show argued that because of basically tech reasons, Data could just be regenerated because of basically magic technology. So you can't even kill Data in that concept. So things like that, there are hundreds of people who, where we're not even talking about the fan fiction people, there are hundreds of people who just write memory alpha articles online who could have come up with a better story than that. And the people who've done this story in the new Star Trek, focusing a lot on trauma, a lot on grittiness as an attempt to create something that's authentic, took something that used to generate billions of dollars in merchandise and made it generate essentially nothing worth noting on the last corporate earnings reports for CBS and Viacom.
You gotta consume that product, right? Just consume product and get excited for the next product.
Well, so how do we know that that it was necessarily motivated by trauma theory and ideology, as opposed to just being motivated by, okay, we need to get this out as quickly as possible because we need it in by the next media cycle? Maybe it was just motivated by a quest for profit.
So
just,
if
wait.
If you watch it and you start to watch and you start to read up the theories, you start to look for it, you'll see the handiwork with it. It's like the book Save the Cat, which is one of the most influential books on screenwriting. Once you read how Save the Cat works, once you look at a few structural beat sheets on how Save the Cat teaches people to write, you go watch a movie, you'll see the fundamentals of how movies are structured based around that book.
Well, I mean, if you have an influential book, obviously you're going to see its effects in culture. Like, say, let's look at what's a good example of this? I think it was called The Wolf, a book on wolves. So look at...
Oh, the thing that created the meme about alpha, beta, and various pack dynamics.
Yes. Look at the influence on pulp culture and sociology before and after this book is written, and you'll begin to see, okay, in the way we view animals, in the way we view other humans, it's shifted a lot. This is usually something that happens with influential products. They spread everywhere, and then their influences can be found everywhere.
Yeah.
Regardless of their truth or validity.
But when you look at that, that gets into also a lot of what gets written in TV and movies, and comics and books tend to follow behind that, tends to go in trends. And there's multiple trends that all interplay together. Like the young adult trend was a very big thing in like the first half of this decade, and a little bit in the tail end of the last decade.
Like the Hunger Games.
Like the Hunger Games, which...
Divergent.
Oh,
Divergent.
right. Oh man, I remember seeing Divergent. I only saw the second movie. I thought.
And you notice how those things were very steeped in trauma. The Percy Jackson series of books actually has gone into various interesting angles with intersectionality as well as trauma theory, which is kind of fascinating to me.
Too bad they didn't. Too bad they didn't produce a great series of movies.
Well, yeah, that one was pretty dreadful.
I mean, and it's really, really baffling how you got a guy, his dad's Poseidon, somebody stole Zeus's lightning bolt, blamed him. He goes on a mystery quest across the United States to find it. He goes into Hades. You can make that a good story, but I think that was a big problem. Was the casting wasn't really good for that movie, and casting youth is always difficult. The core group from the Harry Potter movies was basically the best group of young actors that were ever assembled to play characters over a longitudinal period of time. The only real one that kind of had a point where he kind of slipped out was the guy who played Snape, but he got better at the end once he went through puberty a little bit better.
The one who played Snape?
Yeah, Malfoy, excuse me. I confused the names in my head for a second.
Yeah,
the kid who played Malfoy for like a little bit in the middle there, he wasn't in the movies a lot because he kind of was a little bit more awkward with his puberty than everybody else.
Mm.
And he then, that's why he had such a stronger role at the last movie, because he kind of grew into himself.
Yeah, well, it didn't really stop him becoming from such a fangirl favorite during the intervening years.
Well, of course. Of course. For the generation that grew up on that, it's your Tiger Beat type situation. Absolutely. I however am very disconnected from Harry Potter because I was just the age cohort a little bit past it. So it was something I hated instinctively when I was younger. And then later I kind of came around to say, it's fine. It's like when I watched Ender's Game and then I later read the book Ender's Game, I'm like going, man, if I had read this when it first came out, I would have loved the heck out of this.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I liked Harry Potter. It was a pretty good book series. I don't really see the need for it to continue in desperate movies and other things, but I think that's kind of the...
Well, J.K. Rowling is a billionaire, and these movies will make some money, so she gets to make as many of them as she wants.
Exactly. And that is what I see as the core problem, really, is, not necessarily an over-application of trauma theory or etiology in pop culture, so much as a desire to make money at all costs and to use whatever method is popular to do it.
But the Fantastic Beasts series is another perfect example of trauma theory because your central character is on the autism spectrum, although the movie plays fast and loose with it. There's the homosexual relationship between Dumbledore and Grindelwald.
But that one's barely even mentioned in the movie. There's one line where he says, so you were close when you were growing up. You were close as brothers. And then Dumbledore says closer than brothers. And that's about it.
Yeah. And that really kind of gets into a very superficial and shallow way we view human relationships now, but that's a whole other thing. But, you have that. You have the way they set up the thing with, the Lestrange lady, whose name is completely escaping me, the one
Bellatrix?
who... not Bellatrix from the original movies, the one in the second movie whose name is completely blanking out of my head right now.
No idea.
She was the love interest for Scamander back when they were both kids at Hogwarts, but then she was engaged to his brother, and there was like a really vague plot line there with that, and how she killed a baby, but
What?
she didn't really kill the right baby. Yeah, she killed a baby. So there was a whole plot about,
It was accidental, I think. It was her brother, and then they were on the Titanic or something, and she left the baby in a room, and then she fled the Titanic. She's like, oh no, I forgot the baby. Whoops.
That's kind of weird.
But that gets into the whole, a child who's very angry and young and doesn't have good emotion and impulse control, they do something traumatic that influences them for the whole rest of their life. But that's not the greatest sin of the Fantastic Beasts Grindelwald series. The Fantastic Sin is, you know what we need is a generation before Magic Hitler, another Magic Hitler. But a Magic Hitler who says, I need to be Magic Hitler to stop human Hitler.
Well, yeah, I think it's pretty clear that he's being a manipulator there, that he's selling people what they want to hear. And I thought that was kind of what part of the movie was like, oh, you know, this sort of fake messaging can convince people that horrible ideologies are necessary or needed even when they're not.
But let's get off the sidetrack, because we're on a little sidetrack with this movie, but the central problem is you can only have Magic Hitler once. Unless you do it like thousands of years earlier, like Tolkien did with the broader Silmarillion series. You can't have Magic Hitler and then within the lifetime of Magic Hitler, another Magic Hitler happens. That doesn't work within the story universe. It doesn't make sense. It's just foolish.
Well, I mean, it was already in the backstory of the series, but there didn't need to necessarily be a whole movie series on the little bit of backstory that, oh yeah, Voldemort, there was once a guy who was kind of like Voldemort, and Dumbledore was kind of involved with him when he was a bit younger.
And they had an epic magic battle.
It was
literally. There's no story.
It was window screen dressing. It wasn't intended to be a movie series, but then it became a movie series. For worse. I was going to say for better or for worse, but I definitely think for worse.
And Rogue One is another example of that, which, while there is trauma in Rogue One, it's not done in a great deal. It's actually done more artfully. But Rogue One was another story where we got the Death Star plans. Is it interesting of a story how we got the Death Star plans? No, it's not. You got the Death Star plans, which has been done in multiple different Star Wars video games, been done multiple different times in the Star Wars tabletop game. It's been done in Star Wars comic books. So are you going to make a movie version of that story that tells people, you remember that game you played on the PS1 where you got the Death Star plans and you felt really awesome for doing that? Well, we're going to make a movie that's going to make you feel like that wasn't even as awesome as it could have been. You're never going to win that game, so don't even try.
I like Rogue One. Well,
I mean, it's a fine movie. It's a fine movie.
I haven't seen it, and I haven't played the video games either. So,
right.
Although Rogue One is really remembered for that Darth Vader scene at the end, because you never just see him just massacre a bunch of rebel soldiers like that. That's
unless
like the only,
you play the video games.
That's the only thing that people
read the comic books.
Or read the comic books. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the only thing that people actually remember. Do you remember the character name?
Jyn Erso?
Oh, dang. You ruined the joke.
I do have really good memory for things like that.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Dang.
But, and another thing that's part of this whole exploitation of the hip new modern thing in culture, did you guys talk about the terrible comic book characters that Marvel designed, Snowflake and Safe Space?
No.
No, because it seemed too much of a gimmick. It didn't really seem like, I don't know who this was intended to be for. Presumably people like me, but I don't really read comic books.
Right, but you're at least familiar with the topic. So Volt's not familiar, but that's fine. So they came up with a retake on the classic comic book, The New Warriors, which was basically kind of an awkward and weird comic book. I actually owned at one point in time like 2 or 3 years of the initial run. Where they took all the kid characters they had in the Marvel comic universe and just threw them into a team that didn't make any sense.
Oh, Amir's no longer here.
I saw that. He popped out. Okay. So
it's a bit weird because unfortunately you were in the middle of an explanation for his benefit. So
I know. Well, we'll give him a minute to get back to that.
Mm-hmm.
But while we're waiting, the only one of those characters I really liked as an idea was B Negative. The kid who was like a goth kid, like into the whole vampire thing. I'm like saying, you can make that like a cringe culture character, like who's into all the cringy vampire stuff from like the old vampire movies and the new vampire movies. And like I said, you could have actually made something out of that idea.
Who dresses like a scene kid from the early 2000s.
Yeah. That was a character design idea that actually could have went somewhere. I mean, then you have the guy who got his... Oh, here we go. So, back to the explanation. So the new Warriors, they took all of the Kid Marvel characters except for a couple of them from the 70s and 80s, dumped them into a team book, so they were all in a team together. The characters were kind of edgy 90s teens, so it worked. They came back again later in like the 2000s and tried to restart the team, which was the kickoff event for Marvel's Civil War comic series, which I'm not a fan of. It was terrible. So because it's
Really? I thought you would like it.
Oh no. The core message of the Civil War series is, what if we take the global war on terror but make George Bush the hero in it? That was the premise behind Civil War.
Well, it was also really stupid because like Iron Man had this like interdimensional prison where he threw all the heroes in.
And there were lots of things that were character. There were lots of things that were character assassinations of people's characters.
Yeah,
that didn't
like
make
what
sense
was up
within
with that?
continuity. So because intellectual
was Spider-Man a big victim of that?
He was a big victim in that, which then led to One More Day, which allegedly, and allegedly I mean he's basically said, yes, this is why it happened. Joe Quesada, the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, said, I'm getting divorced and I don't want to be involved with Spider-Man being married, so we're going to have Spider-Man lose Mary Jane as his wife, but we can't have Spider-Man get divorced because that's immoral. He'll give up his marriage to Satan, though. He'll sell his marriage to Satan. That is fine. That is perfectly fine.
Wait. How is that better than just getting a healthy divorce?
Because Spider-Man felt guilty that his revealing his secret identity killed Aunt May, which, here's a thought, maybe that could have been 2 or 3 good years of Spider-Man stories. Maybe him and MJ struggling through their marriage because of that could have been good, compelling writing. But no,
and they could have made it work as well. You just because you have problems, it doesn't mean that your relationship must end.
Exactly. So because we live in the world of modern intellectual property, piracy, and regenerating, basically every 10 years they're going to do a mini-series on every piece of comic book IP, provided that the current global pandemic crisis doesn't make the comic book industry get sober. So they brought out these comic book characters as the new Warriors. Now, here's a little thing about the business. There's a reason Marvel Comics is so successful is because it has a giant publication thing that gets them licenses and everything. So a company wants to do business with Marvel because Marvel can get their eyes on their product. So what does Marvel do? They create characters known as Safe Space, Snowflake. They have a character who got his powers from experimental internet gas. They have a body-positive female character whose powers comes from a magic backpack that is basically an unlimited dimensional holding pouch, and a vampire scene kid. And they do that to draw outrage from people on the internet so that Marvel can say, see, look at all the views we got on this basically garbage idea. So so Marvel and a lot of the big Hollywood industry things, they're not against the people complaining about their products or saying, you're ruining our childhood, you're destroying our Star Wars. No, they exploit those people as a resource to say, see, look at how many people we could have looking at your product when it's associated with our product.
In some ways, you could say that is in part a consequence of outrage culture on social media and on YouTube, which encourages complaining about new aspects of characters, which in turn inadvertently leads to hate clicks, rage clicks, and more ad revenue for the people they're supposed to be trying to tear down.
And it's on the flip side because there's 2 sides of this, and there are people who are exploited in clickbait media who are basically getting paid $1 an article, and they write a couple hundred articles on saying, see that tiny background character in the corner there? That's totally a gay character. We swear. You don't know who that is? Well, I mean, it's a character and they're gay and there, aren't you happy?
Wasn't there was that kiss scene in The Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah. Which got cut out when it went to China.
Exactly.
Much like the lesbian character in the new Pixar one that's a fantasy adventure series that's name is completely escaping me right now. Onward, yeah. So then a police officer was a lesbian who said, hey, I have the same problem with my girlfriend's daughter. Also got cut out for China.
And
there's 2 different spheres of internet outrage that are mobilized for basically peanuts, people working for large multi-billion-dollar corporations who are now going through strong economic trauma because they don't manage their cash on hand well, and Disney World's going to be shut down for the rest of the year. we're taking a massive credit decline. All of our executives are taking a pay cut. Some of them are working for no money, and yeah, we're furloughing 75,000 employees.
So what do you think? So what's the thing I want to get to? What do you think? What's the main purpose of storytelling? Why do we tell stories of fantastic heroes like Hercules to
I
Iron
mean,
Man? Just what's
my
the
my
point?
f- my favorite thing is a quote from the Hogfather. Let me see if I can pull that up here.
Oh, you read Terry Pratchett?
I do, and also there's a very good TV series about it. Let me pull this up here because this is one of the most quotable things from the Hogfather series. Is like, all right, said Susan, I'm not stupid. You're saying humans need fantasies to make life bearable? Really, as if it was some kind of pink pill. No humans needing fantasies to be human, to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. Tooth fairies, hogfathers, yes, as practice. You have to start out learning to believe the little lies so that we can believe the big ones. Yes, justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing. They're not the same at all. You think so? Take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder and sieve it through the finest sieve. And then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy, and yet, Death waved a hand, and yet you act as if there's some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it might be judged. Yes, but people have to go believe that, or what's the point? My point exactly. So the point of stories is to give us the ability to imagine how things could be, and give us the courage to make the world how it could be.
The courage to build a better world.
So you think of stories as like essentially aspirational things.
Yeah, and Jordan Peterson, like him or lump him, he's a very good scholar in Jungian circles.
Lump him?
Like him or lump him.
I've never heard that expression before.
That's an old-time reference for giving someone lumps by beating them. He talks about how storytelling as a form of cathartic management of emotions has been what the purpose of storytelling has been since the earliest caveman days.
Oh man. So what do you think the purpose of tragedy is, since the pessimistic art form of the Athenians? You think it's a call for strength, a call for wisdom, the purpose of tragedy, right? That seems to be what I think.
I think stories can serve different purposes. On one hand, yeah, a lot of stories are aspirational. They teach us if we had these abilities, we could build a better world. And here's how we can be inspired by these great figures who've done amazing things and take a bit of that courage and a bit of that strength into our own lives and then execute it. To me, though, stories can also be about empathy. They can be about, here's something, that's gone wrong in my life. Here's something that's gone right in mine. Here's something that's just different about my life. And here's a way that I can share it with the world. Or here's a way I can share about an experience of someone who can't necessarily share their experience with the world. Here's how my experience would be if we were living in a completely different world. Here's how we can imagine something completely different. I think, storytelling is about empathy. It's about putting ourselves in impossible situations and thinking, what would we do with that?
I mean, again, Aristotle has a great definition. He defines tragedy as the imitation of an action that is serious and also has as having magnitude complete in itself. Tragedy is a form of drama, exciting emotions of pity and fear. Its action should be single and complete, presenting a reversal of fortune involving persons' renown and/or superior attainments, and it should be written in poetry, embellished with every kind of artistic expression. The writer presents incidents arousing pity and fear wherewith to interpret its catharsis of such emotions, which is root in what you're talking about with empathy. And then we get into, let me see what Shakespeare's definition of tragedy.
Are we going to bring up Nietzsche next?
Well, the Nietzschean sense of tragedy gets a little bit more complicated because we haven't caught up to Nietzsche yet.
Intellectually, are you sure about that?
No, we haven't caught up to him yet.
You don't think we're living in the days of the last men?
I think it's certainly I think a lot of his ideas are bearing fruit, but I think it's a lot like. Did you ever read Heinlein?
No, I can't say I have.
Heinlein has a lot of problematic issues in his story if you're a person who's concerned with that sort of thing. But Heinlein has a literary trope in his stories called the stupid ages, where there was a time in which we were all stupid and dumb and terrible things happened, but we got better. For Heinlein, the stupid ages was always a fixed point of time behind us. We've always just gotten out of the stupidity. And he actually wrote some books where you were hip deep in the stupid ages. One of them being Revolt in 2100, which I highly recommend. It's about a religious theocracy that's taken, a corrupt religious theocracy that's taken over the United States of America. And it's about the perspective of an audience viewpoint character who goes and joins the revolutionary cabal that's fighting them, which is very largely based off of the Freemasons. And it's actually impressive from a literary standpoint, because I am a Freemason, so I can go into some context on this. Is he talks about a lot of things that if you Google it, you can find the information about Freemasons that he writes. But the way he writes the experiences of the character is such that they're well grounded and informed in that actual frame of experience, which is fascinating, and nobody's ever come up with a good answer as to where that came from in his writing. So there's always this ill-defined period where we've just gotten out of the cave, just sloughed off our form, but that's also a byproduct of Whig history, which is a fallacious idea that's real dominant in culture, that we're all progressing towards a natural evolved point of cultural perfection.
It's 2020, man. Get the time,
It's
man.
#current year.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who are invested in that concept will argue on how Sarah Connor as a character in the original 2 Terminator movies was not a feminist icon, but Sarah Connor in the most recent Terminator movie was, when she's just a bitter woman who's angry that she had her kid and she was used to have the kid and she didn't have any meaning in her own life, which was not the point of those first 2 movies.
Do you think the Terminator film series should die eventually?
No, I actually did a video with another friend who's came up on his YouTube thing. It shouldn't die, but it should be written by people who actually care.
So do you think James Cameron should come back since he written the first 2 great films?
No, James Cameron doesn't want to come back. He only comes back for media and advertising purposes because he wants his friends to make money.
And don't we all want our friends to make money?
Right, but that's why James Cameron always comes back to endorse the subsidiary Terminator projects. He's told his 2 perfect stories, which are basically the same story if you look into the finer points of it, in 2 movies. So, and all the more these worst movies come out, his movies still look good because they're still some of the best movies ever made.
I think
including Avatar.
Better. The more you have something bad to compare something to, the better it will be. I mean, after all, doesn't the Avatar: The Last Airbender series look even better than before when it is compared with the dreadful Shyamalan adaptation?
Or The Legend of Korra.
Yeah, Legend of Korra is like a beautiful disaster.
Well, the thing about Avatar: The Last Airbender is it's very much one of those, this is lightning in a bottle. Have either of you watched Dragon Prince on Netflix?
I have
begun. I watched the first season and the bit of the second season.
Me too. Same.
The showrunner for that show was the lead writer on Avatar: The Last Airbender. He didn't come along with them when they made The Legend of Korra. And when you look at The Legend of Korra and you look at The Dragon Prince, you see the strengths of all 3 of the major creative forces of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and you see why the subsidiary products aren't as good, because they're missing key components in collaboration.
And humor, like Legend of Korra wasn't really that funny, or didn't have that.
The thing with Korra is that I thought it was at its weakest when it was trying to imitate Avatar in its sense of humor. It had stronger humor when it was trying to build its own ground. Like Varric was a genuinely funny character.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't trying to retread jokes that had done better in Avatar.
Though I think fundamentally the fatal flaw in Legend of Korra is they removed the Avatar's journey. Because the Avatar's journey is not only what makes the Avatar an interesting idea, it's also how the Avatar becomes a part of the world, learns the problems of the world, and becomes the Gestalt for the solution to the problems of the world.
Oh, yeah, she didn't explore. Somehow she mastered 3 out of the 4 elements at the age of 4.
Yeah. And yet she's somehow defeated in almost every single fight she's in.
Yeah,
that was one of the more what aspects of the show. Like, I get that they want to show that the antagonists are a real threat, and that's good. You shouldn't have a main character that always wins. after all, like most of Avatar: The Last Airbender spent running away from the Fire Nation as opposed to actively trying to fight them. But I thought there was a certain amount of weakness in Korra's character that didn't seem to be like necessarily justified by, like she was going through tough times. A lot of the times it just seemed like she was a feeble person.
Yeah. And you also look at the world building as it reinforced everything in Avatar: The Last Airbender. And what did steampunk 1920s, basically America, but a little bit of Hong Kong, add to the story of The Legend of Korra?
Modernity, the death of
No.
spirituality. Are you sure
No.
that could have been a
Well,
great
let me
writing
rephrase that.
point?
Let me rephrase that. They did try to do that, but then they pivoted and did the Avatar 1 thing for the rest of the season.
I didn't mind the Avatar. My favorite episode from Legend of Korra is the origins reveal.
The Avatar 1 episodes are very good. Yeah. I actually thought that season 2 though was the weakest of all of the 4 seasons. By like not even by like a little bit, by a lot. Like the quality was drastically worse.
But the thing that I find fascinating about the Avatar 1 season is you have a show that's well-versed and grounded in Eastern philosophy and religion, and then you reboot it to be a Christian allegory story.
Good versus evil.
Not just good versus evil, but the flesh is weak and the source of evil of the world. Spirit is the true purity and good. The sacrificial redeemer figure.
Wow, the Last Airbender was more about restoring balance.
Yes, because the philosophy, the world, all of that stuff fit together as a cohesive unit.
Although there is a bit of a subversion there because the evil being is, of the spirit world and is very connected with the spirits, and the villain wants to have the spirits have free reign over the earth. And ultimately, what Korra decides to do is mend the barrier between the two worlds.
Right. However, that person, that spirit takes over the person who told Korra, you weren't raised correctly. All these bad things happened. It's not your fault that you're not the person you want to be. So the corrupting spirit was infected into the male figure who was trying to be a foster father, who was trying to provide her with the guidance that she never got.
Well, to be fair, that guy, those things that he said to her all seemed like manipulations. Like he wasn't.
But they're also true if you look at the show, though.
They are true to an extent, but manipulation. The best kind of manipulation I've always found is one where you tell truth to the other person, truth garnered to make them act the way you want them to.
Subtle suggestions.
Selectively selected truth.
Yeah. But so that we've been going at this about an hour. This was a good hour.
Mm-hmm.
So
how much longer you want to blow this up?
Well, I was considering just going until the end of the hour, but if you two
No, I was just asking because personally, you don't want to go too long in a YouTube video.
Let's end it here, man.
No, we can still talk. We got a couple minutes. As I was mentioning to Lapis earlier, my comic book, I've paid for the first 2 pages, so I might pop back on once I have some actual pages, and you could do something different. You could actually talk about something that's in the process of being created.
So how's your Samson-like protagonist is going?
I mean, the story's basically done. I just have to polish the draft again, but I have to go to my artist and say, hey, listen, let's start picking some pages we want to draw. Which ones do you think are going to look the most awesome? And those are going to be the first ones I'm going to pay for to put up on crowdfunding.
So you said Samson-like.
So here's the gist of the story. It takes elements of the isekai genre. It takes elements of the swords and sorcery genre, and it kind of combines them together. So you have a character that was transported from the 1980s to a fantastical world.
Okay.
And this character was inspired in large part by the fact that the original D&D cartoon from the 80s, the characters never got an ending. So
I've seen that cartoon. I love it.
Yeah, so some comic book writer in like a backup story for the D&D comic book wrote a story of them all as grown-up adults in the world of Greyhawk. I think Greyhawk was the one they were in, or the Forgotten Realms, either one. That fascinated me as an idea, like, what if you take an isekai protagonist who, he doesn't become the magical lord of awesomeness at 13 or 14? What if he just grows up to be a normal man, albeit a normal man for a fantasy setting, and that's when the adventure comes around and gets him.
Mm.
So that was sort of the genesis for the story. I then laced in good elements of Celtic mythology because as I was writing the story, I said, well, why don't I combine that? And they just started layering on from there.
Mm.
And then
His character design reminds me of Samson.
Yeah, because I wanted the concept for the character was he's very strong, a very physically powerful character because he's from 20th century Earth, so he had better nutrition for the first 13, 14 years of his life. And then he was able to be given the more elite training and stuff to build up to becoming a more physically potent person than anyone on the planet.
Hmm.
And he's more intelligent than the average person on the planet because, again, he had some basis of modern education.
But what would you say is his fatal flaw, his hubris, his weakness?
I'm actually going with more of a Japanese style story, where it's
Okay.
not about the conflict of the character, it's more about how the events make a sudden turn. So the entire plot of the story turns on a couple of axis points. One of the major ones is the Morrigan shows up in the story. She wasn't something I planned to write in the story, she just showed up. And she decides to give him the call to adventure because he recognizes who she is immediately in her alternate form, and she asks him if she's still remembered, and he does her the kindness of telling her the truth of her being still remembered, and that's why she gives him the call to adventure. And she tells him that people like you aren't chosen, but you always make a choice. And he says, well, what if I don't? And she says, then this world will fall into bloodshed and ruin, and you won't be lucky enough to have it take you.
Man. Also, I personally got a lot of Narnia vibes from your story.
Well, yeah, because Narnia also is in that same genre of an isekai story. Actually, I've recently been reading the Chronicles of Amber. They have a great radio play version of it that's on YouTube. I highly recommend. And that was based off of an earlier book from the 1940s, which was basically an isekai story. You could argue that Rip Van Winkle and Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court also fit into the same genre conventions of tropes of that story. So it's been with us for a while as an idea.
But, you know, a lot of what can be said of tropes is what do you do with them, but also how do you subvert them? Are you interested in subverting tropes, or do you think you're going to be playing more direct with them? Because that doesn't necessarily mean, like, a story can be very good and also very, you know, very full
Cliche?
of formulaic is what I was going with. You know,
so the structure of the story I've based around the major arcana of the tarot.
okay.
So there's multiple books that I have planned out, and each book is organized around several tarot cards. It's the first 4 that are core to the first story. And no, excuse me, it's 0 through 3, and then it's 4 for the rest of the stories. And so it's about the main character and a secondary main character that's a princess who's a wizard, but humans aren't allowed to be wizards. And that leads to the conflict with the antagonist when she reveals herself to be a wizard and it goes all horribly wrong. And she is put into a dangerous, precarious situation that she doesn't have the resources to get herself out of. And the main character, because of his experience from Earth, because of his knowledge that he brings with him from Earth to here, is literally the only person who can instigate the change to get her out of the situation she's in. Can't go into too much more detail because that really gets into spoiling the sauce a little bit too much.
But can you describe the story, your version of Constantinople will create?
I came up with an idea of basically, what if Constantinople, but it was built by elves?
Oh. So like a very diverse city, but also at the center of the world, but also...
So one of the background fantasy elements of the story is the elves used to be a much more dominant species, but they receded. At one point in time, the goblins were basically a Mongol-like people that had a glorious empire, but they also receded. And then the humans took over the city, and so it has elements of the elves, the Mongol goblins, and the humans into this whole diverse patchwork city.
Okay.
Also, one of the main characters is a goblin, and he gets, as his long-term character arc in the story, is he gets to redeem the goblins and cure them of their racial curse that allows them to go to their afterlife.
Okay, so what is? Well, I suppose you can't really tell me the specifics of the curse.
Basically, the goblins, like how the Mongols fell apart in the Civil War, there was two factions, and they both cursed each other to be prohibited from going to the lands of their dead and their beloved ancestors.
Oh, I see.
A lot of mysticism, man. You're like
Yeah.
ancient philosophy, man.
Yeah.
So
And the other major characters is there's a half-elf female who's a paladin of the human religion.
I suppose that might get her some dislike from her full elf compatriots.
Well, no, she lives among the humans because, again, most of the elves have receded from the world.
Oh, but there are still some scattered communities, surely.
Right. And one of them is her boyfriend is an elf, because elves have a spiritual connection that forms the core of their romantic belief system. So there's not only a person who's literally born for you on the world, you have a spiritual connection that you find that person.
Well, I guess you have to. I guess you will inevitably end up with each other because it's, it's fate. It's what it's meant to be.
But yes, this is a world where humans are the dominant species because everybody else has receded. And that ties into the antagonist and the broader cycle of what's going on in the story.
It would be funny if the antagonist was like, okay, we're the next species. You humans have had your Simon the Sun.
Oh, no. The antagonist is the god of the humans, who is a figure I based largely off of Conan. So imagine if King Conan from the Conan books, instead of fading into the background and allowing his kingdom to proceed organically, decided that he couldn't allow humankind to fail and wither into dust, and so he achieves apotheosis and becomes the god at a cost.
So he's basically evil Talos.
Kinda. But Talos, who's a Conan-like figure. And the religion and its related organs are the principal agencies of the antagonist that you're going to see throughout most of the books.
And you're more like Tolkien. You seem like you got everything planned out.
It's not that you have everything planned out. You have to have the right things planned out. And then other things just pop up to you in your head. Like during one of the editing sessions, somebody suggested, look, you should put in a flashback sequence in there. So I did that. I decided the Morrigan should be the narrator because, of course, that's her mythological appropriate role as a figure. And then that ties into other ideas I have for later on in the book. So you don't plan things like that out. You just say, hey, I should do this, and then say, hey, if I do this, I could do this, 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 and this down the road.
It seemed like you got the story vaguely ran out in your head.
Well, a lot of the stories I tell, and I'm getting to the point of eventually building and selling, God willing, hopefully, are stories that I've told to myself several times and never quite had the stories right, always tweak them, and then it comes into focus.
So what's a story you prefer? What get you... Like, what do you prefer? What genre do you prefer?
It really depends on your mood. Like, for example, Beastars, I know you guys talked about that last time you did a show. I hate watch that show. I'm actually probably the one who inspired him the most to watch it. But then I went to sleep and I was like, it's actually really clever and interesting. But like initially when you watched it, you had a very visceral reaction. Because I was having a bad day and I just watched that and I'm like going, what?
It's definitely a what kind of show.
Wait. We're gonna do a vor plot, but we're not gonna do it for titillation. We're gonna do it for a straight up, actual, legitimate, traumatic plot, but it being focused on vor. What? That was profoundly bizarre to me.
It was certainly an experience to watch.
The music,
and they're making a second season, so
it's more.
It's based on a manga, a very, very popular manga in Japan.
I think the manga is still ongoing, but it has like 6 or 8 chapters that are out.
Boku no. Man, I just been binging Boku no Academia for the past several weeks.
But that is actually Beastars is a good example of how, if you want to tell a good story that actually means something and connects to people, you need to actually put in care and effort in building your characters.
Yeah.
Characters make their decisions because it's not only organic to the character, but because it makes sense in the world of the story.
Yeah.
It moves the story along.
Although I still find the world of Beastar, it's a little like, what?
What
Why
you
does
mean?
he say?
You mean carnivorous animals living off of vegetable protein? Which no, that wouldn't work. Not at a
Yeah,
fundamental
like,
biological level.
I was thinking like maybe they could live off of like bugs or something, like large quantities of killed bugs, or maybe it could be like sea fish. Like, oh yeah, fish aren't animals, so you could just eat those.
Yeah.
Maybe that
And,
would make a bit more sense than just like having them eat tofu.
and later on in the manga, they explain why the cannibal market exists. So I don't want to get into spoilers for that if you haven't had the opportunity to read the manga yet.
I have not
Oh,
read the manga. I probably will never read the manga.
I don't like the art.
I
And
don't
art is
like
really
reading manga. The only one I've read is Inuyasha, like all the way through.
So something I'm going to recommend for you guys before we wrap this up is the Monogatari series and its related spin-offs. An excellent anime. The one I recommend is the one that focuses on the relationship between the vampire and the principal human male and protagonist of the series. They did a series of 3 movies, which was one of the more interesting vampire stories I've ever actually seen.
Sonagachi or Monogatari?
Well, no, there's ones that focus around the cat, there's ones that focus on the vampire, and then there's the main story.
Oh, what's the story called?
Monogatari. It's like the whole family of anime. A lot of the humor, though, is very much related to Japanese puns
Okay.
and weird things in Japanese grammar. But the vampire story was fascinating. Is there's this human who's kind of like on the edge of the world of supernatural. He found this mutilated vampire in a subway, and he just gives himself to her to drain him of his blood so she can get healthy and survive.
So, are you also gonna recommend the Legends of Galactic Heroes?
Well, I mean, that's also an excellent anime series. It's really great.
Oh, that's the one where the democracy is fighting this evil empire.
It's basically the space Franco-Prussian war, but the German leader is actually Alexander the Great instead of Bismarck. Although I think they had a Bismarckian figure in the series. But what's fascinating is they take the evil German tropes and they use them, but they have them being morally different characters, not morally evil characters. So
and
it's
then
kind
there's
of
also evil on the side of democracy as well.
yes, and there's religious terrorists that are run by the Space Catholic Church.
As you do. Anyway.
As you do. And it's an interesting show talking about military tactics too. And it does interesting hard science fiction things like we went back to radar because all the more advanced ways of detection, we figured out a whole lot more ways to confuse those. But it's a lot harder to just confuse radar.
Mm-hmm.
Man, I need to finish that.
Legends of Galactic Heroes?
Legend of Galactic Heroes.
And that was a, 1980s, 1990s anime?
Yeah.
Yes, and the manga series is only just now starting to get translated. And they did a reboot series that didn't do as well, and they're in the process of doing a remastered series where they've made some bad editorial choices, but they've at least updated the animation for that, though. But that gets into the whole issue with localization in the anime industry.
All right, all good topics for another time.
Yep. Thanks for having me on, and you guys have a great day.
All right. Bye-bye, Amir.
Bye.
Thanks for the stream. Larry certainly has a lot of interesting opinions about literature. I don't find myself entirely agreeing with all of them, but I think I need to do more research on trauma theory. It certainly sounds interesting.
He left a bunch of links in the private chat before.
Oh, cool.
Interesting guy. Interesting guy. Yeah. He's probably one of the smartest people I know, or a guy who has a lot of life experience and really thought about them deeply.
Yeah, well, he is a good 2 or 3 decades older than the both of us.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I enjoyed talking to him, and I'd do it again. I just like to investigate a lot of his ideas a lot more because it's interesting. I don't know if I entirely agree with the thesis of the idea that trauma theory is at heart the problem and behind the destruction of modern media.
It's certainly a more complex topic why stories seem to be going down in the
Mm.
in terms of quality.
I feel like to some degree it's like a nostalgia bias. We tend to view things in our past with a rosier lens and that what's coming forward. But honestly, a lot of what is coming forward is quite weak. And honestly, I think it's because it's so derivative. It's all based off of old source materials as opposed to being off of original concepts.
Or they don't play off against the tropes or revert them, or I don't know, like it depends. Like if you want to deconstruct a topic, you gotta be you kind of ask yourself, what's the point? What's the point of the story, right? The
Yeah.
story you're making. And if you just doing it for the sake of deconstruction, then you just kind of leave yourself wondering, why did I read that? What's the lessons to be learned here? Unless you're going to
Yeah.
choose it to interpret it as a cautionary tale. Like,
Well,
let's
yeah.
say The Watchmen, which is the famous deconstruction of superheroes. You have Dr. Manhattan. Yeah. Well, peace. Don't know what just happened. Bye.